Welcome to the Go Dyslexia podcast, where dyslexia experts share strategies, technology, products, stories, and more. I'm Dr. Erica Warren, and I want to welcome you to our community. Brought to you by LearningSpecialistCourses.com, multi-sensory educational and occupational therapy courses for teachers, practitioners, and parents. All right. So I'm so excited to welcome Pete Bowers, who is a literacy expert and a teacher and a researcher. And he's here to give us some new ideas on what we can do to help individuals with dyslexia. So welcome, Pete.
Well, it's a delight to be here.
So tell me a little bit about why you believe that you are a dyslexia expert.
One of the first times I did a workshop down in the States with, I've done a lot of work with dyslexia centers who asked me to come down. And one of the earliest times, I don't know, it must have been 2012 or something. I was talking to the group and I was and they are at a dyslexic center. They work with dyslexic kids all the time. And I was trying to signal to them that, I'm not actually an expert in dyslexia. I certainly know a lot more about it now than I did in 2012. But and I kind of said offhandedly, although I probably am dyslexic. And it was funny because the director who had invited me up by that point just kind of stopped the meeting and asked all of the people so who's already identified Pete as dyslexic, and they all raised their hands. So that was my formal diagnosis. But what I was saying was that I don't think of myself as an expert in dyslexia, all the details that you can get into about that. But what I do understand really well is how the writing system works. And my argument was, if you're working with dyslexic kids, one thing that I'm really confident would be super helpful is if you had a really good understanding how the writing system works. So I'm really targeting educators' understanding of the writing system so that they can bring that understanding to bear when they work with anybody. But my argument would be that kids who are dyslexic, identified as dyslexic, or have difficulties in literacy for any reason, they are more in need of an accurate understanding of the writing system than those who are not. So while we will be talking a lot about dyslexia and why I would argue the work that I do with structured word inquiry is particularly important for them. It's not designed to be for dyslexics. It's designed around how the writing system works. And what I try to show is that actually it helps everybody. There's my mentor in this work had just said something one time that I always remember, where he argued that dyslexic should be the litmus test for instruction, meaning if the instruction you are using is not working for your people you've identified as dyslexic, instead of just assuming that dyslexics have some problem, what if we use the failure of our instruction to succeed for that group as a reason to relook at our instruction to see if we can improve it in such a way that helps those guys? And if we do that, it turns out, actually, I think what we end up finding is we find a better way to teach non-dyslexics. But what I guess a brief way of looking at that is those, so I was a terrible speller all my life, like just brutal. Actually, I'm in danger of starting down a long story, so I don't know if you want me to keep going. But I was a terrible speller as a classroom teacher. I taught 10 years. And I taught that English spelling was crazy, and I was frustrated by it. But I didn't have much interest in spelling instruction because here I was teaching in pretty fancy private overseas schools and doing well. And I was a grade 4 teacher, and I was a terrible speller. So how important could spelling be? I could use as a rationalization. And then spell checkers were coming on, and so you have those kind of arguments. But the other thing that got me was I just never seen any teacher who was excited about their spelling instruction. I'd never seen a teacher who had kids arrive in their classroom, and then they taught spelling in such a way that kids who arrived as really poor spellers or have a bad self-concept around their spelling, and then the teacher did something in their spelling instruction, and some of their kids were transformed by the end of the year, and now really liked spelling, really, felt like they were good at it. That didn't. Whereas I and other teachers, we'd have kids come in who didn't like science. You might do something that gets them into science. Kids who didn't like to read, and I would have kids. You could have the possibility of transforming a kid's world around it. Most subjects, never seen it with spelling. And so it just felt like this kind of very unsatisfying domain. And it was so relied on memorization, which didn't interest me much at all as a teacher. And so that was kind of where I was at. I kept trying to improve my instruction, but there'd always be these exceptions. I try to find patterns and my brain, once I can imagine two ways to spell a word, you might as well flip a coin, right? But other kids who have a mind, who are born with a mind with a good orthographic memory, they can run into a word like does or rough or whatever people call irregular, a certain amount of times, and then it gets mapped in their brain and they can read it. And so when they write does, they go DOES, and it doesn't dawn on them to wonder, why is it spelled that way? But if you have a bad orthographic memory like I had, well, it's when you'd go to write that word that you'd rely on what you were taught. And if you rely on what you're typically taught, you would spell does, D-U-Z. So the problem is those for the dyslexics, what I argue is that we have an interaction with misinstruction. We can't cope with having to memorize all these things because we're not good at memorizing. And so when we get told certain things about how the spelling system works, like the Z sound, then why would we put an S in the word does or dogs or anything like that? Right. So we get mapped onto that, but someone who doesn't have that kind of orthographic memory, they don't have to think about it when they do it because they've just got it. So they don't notice the contradictions between what they're taught and what is. But I'm going to argue that it turns out most kids learn how to read and write no matter how we teach them. What we try to do is reduce the number of kids that struggle, right? But even in, the oldest days of literacy instruction, the majority of kids learn to read and write. Many kids struggled, and we've gotten better, and fewer kids struggle, and that's a good thing. And we should just continue to find better instruction. And my argument is, well, the basic premise of structured word inquiry is that whatever we're teaching should accurately reflect the content that we're teaching. And what I discovered was in my 9th year as a classroom teacher, when I ran into real spelling, was presented with linguistic information about how the writing system works. It was like, holy cow, this makes sense. and that's, I think, why it grabbed my attention instantly, because I had this issue in my life as a terrible speller, and instantly things made sense. So I've gone on a lot. I can tell that story, which is actually not a bad way to introduce it if you want. But
right. You had mentioned structured word inquiry. Now, there are going to be a lot of people that are listening to this that have no idea what that is. Tell us a little bit about what this is. And this is something that you discovered. Is that correct?
Well, it's I wouldn't say discovered, but coined, perhaps. So the idea is that I ran into this session that I'll talk about in a second, where this guy who's a linguist did a 45-minute presentation that instantly transformed how I started to look at the writing system. It's not like you can understand it in 45 minutes, but if you get rid of some of the foundational flaws that we usually drive us, all of a sudden you can start to understand. You look at a spelling that you don't understand, and then you can say, "Ooh, that's exciting. I'm going to figure that one out." But if you've always assuming every spelling you can't understand is an exception, you don't get excited about it. Those, and you don't investigate. So So the idea is that after I ran into this work, and I'll go back in a second and kind of introduce that story because it's actually with the words is how you understand. But the point is I started doing it in my classroom and it just turned everything upside down. I had kids fighting over dictionaries. It was absurd, like things you'd never. One of the markers in my brain was we were working on investigating words in the class, and all of a sudden I hear this big thwack. A kid has gone to my new reference section that actually is now being used in a way that it never had been before. And a kid had gone there and he threw a big fat dictionary on the ground and yells, "This dictionary sucks. It doesn't have any Latin roots." And I just like, what? And the thing is, I had for the first time taught in such a way that anybody would have any interest in Latin roots but now it had meaning for them. So they were angry. And the reason the dictionary didn't have it is because it was called a children's dictionary, which doesn't have all the information you need. Right. So he was right. And we threw the dictionary away. We had other good ones. And we had Latin and roots dictionaries. We had etymology dictionaries. And these were just some of the old ones that we realized we weren't using them. My wife was teaching grade 3. I'm teaching grade 4. Lynn Anderson, who's amazing work from Beyond the Word is her website, was teaching, I think, grade 1 at the time. And it just transformed what we did all year. And so I came back to Canada the following year and I was trying to get people interested in this work and was not having much success. And one of the barriers always was the research question. I remember going to a principal that I knew and saying, "Hey, I want to show you what I've been doing." And I come and we talk with her and, we take a word like sign or does, and I explain the spelling of them. And she's, "Well, that's so cool." And then she asked me a question that really kind of baffled me at the time. I think I understand it better now. But one of the first things she said is, "Well, so what does the research say?" And I had no idea, not the slightest idea. It hadn't occurred to me to ask that question in this 1 year I've been teaching with it in Indonesia, of all places. And but I thought what baffled me is, like, if a child had come to ask that principal, "Why is does spelled that?" 5 minutes before I came, the only thing she could have said is, "Well, yeah, that's one of those irregular words you have to memorize," and maybe came up with a mnemonic or something like that. But after 5 minutes of talking to me, she could explain the spelling of does. And so what I didn't understand is, it's not that research isn't important. It's just that I couldn't understand why I would wait until I had research to choose between asking a kid to memorize does or explain it to them. Like, that didn't strike me as a reasonable use of research. It's like, obviously, explaining and understanding is better than relying on memorization. But I realized later that she wasn't asking for herself. She was asking because she's a principal at a public school. And if she's going to have Pete come in and do some PD with her teachers, the first question her uppers are going to ask is, "What does the research say?" And so I realized I'm never going to get anywhere if I can't respond to that question. And we were living back home for a while. We expected to go teaching overseas again. But I said, I'll see if I can go do a master's. Queen's University is in town, which is a major Canadian university. And I was lucky enough to work with John Kirby, who I showed this work to. He was already interested in morphology. And that was the part of, the real spelling work I was doing that kind of jumps out. It's not the only thing by any stretch. But so he took me on and so I did an intervention study. We taught grade 4 and 5 class in the ways that I was learning and compared it to a control group. And that paper came out in 2010. And in the description of the instruction, I needed to describe the intervention instruction. And so I used the phrase structured word inquiry for a couple of important reasons. One is, as a teacher, right from this all the way through, I had seen, while inquiry was central to what I thought was important in teaching, I'd also seen terrible instruction done in the name of inquiry, where people try to get the kids to just discover things without any explicit instruction. And that is not actually good inquiry. To do good inquiry, it has to be structured. You have to guide the inquiry. You have to give the pieces that they inquire with, right? And you have to make judgments about how much do they understand and what don't they understand that they need to understand this thing. So it's a kind of a, it's a craft as well as everything else. And so that's why I called it structured word inquiry, because I did not want to call it word inquiry, because you can do anything if you call it word inquiry. But if it's, so that structured is playing double role. It's structured inquiry about word structure. So that's the genesis of the phrase. The funny thing is, years later, and then it becomes an acronym SWI. And a favorite story is there was somebody who wrote an article in a magazine one time and referred to it as scientific word investigation. And somebody emailed me that, and I contacted the author and I said, well, just so you know, it actually stands for structured word inquiry, but I'm just wishing I was smarter and used scientific word investigation, because that's exactly what it is. And I used to say structured word inquiry is just scientific investigation of the written word, but that was too long.
Right.
I have a problem with verbosity. Anyways, that's really what it is. It's about using scientific investigation and actually teaching how to do that, developing and testing hypotheses, all that, about the spelling and meaning and pronunciations of words, and how it works. And so you can use that scientific approach not only as an instructional approach. So that's what structured word inquiry really is. So
it also embeds memory strategies in the word, which is beautiful, because I call it hooking. When you can find the answer in the question, then you're golden, whether a child needs to memorize something for a test but I love that about structured word inquiry is that, yes, they're looking for that hook. What's the hook? So that whenever they look at the word, they can go back to that story of, oh, okay, the answer is in the question. Can you give us an example of that?
Well, yeah. So let's and you mentioned a couple of things, and I always hesitate talking about this stuff and actually prefer to work with words. So actually, there's a thing that I often use that I try to do first, because if I don't do it first, even just looking at a little bit of word structure helps so much that I have to do this one first for it to be effective. So I'm going to share my screen and see if I can find the slide. Okay, so what I wanted to do to help convey how we engage with words and how practices of structured word inquiry that help the teacher and the student perceive things about the system that they probably didn't previously perceive is here's a kind of a Vorschach test for words, where I flash a word in front of you, and so the listeners at home, I encourage you to have a pen and just do this with us. So the word I'm flashing is disease. So just jot down the first thing that comes to mind when you hear that word. And what we often get would be something like illness or sickness, and that makes total sense. And these days, people might write COVID down or something. But so now, however, what I want to ask everyone at home to do is something that is a central aspect of structured word inquiry practice, I think. And you mentioned something about these ways that I incorporate memory strategies. This is part of that. So instead of thinking about what words relate to it, what I want you to do is actually just write out loud the word disease. And I have to explain that because it actually means exactly what it says. But to write aloud the word disease, you have to say the letter D as you say D and I as you say I. So do me a favor and just write out loud the word disease. So you take your pen and you write it out at home.
So okay. I guess I would say DISEASE.
And now this is how many people do it. And most people, and people get nervous sometimes when I ask them to do this, and they think that I'm testing them, and I'm really not. But that's exactly the way most people do it. They go DIS and then they pause and they say EASE. And I typed it out here with a pause where you paused. If you had paused somewhere else, I would have put the space elsewhere so that we can, because what you're doing when you spell out is you're presenting a hypothesis that you don't even know you have. But if we look at the hypothesis, we can test it, right? Now, when I do this with a group of people and I ask people, when you wrote it out, did you notice anything about the word that you didn't notice previously? And it's at that point that almost always somebody notices that, well, I saw the DIS or I saw the E's. And then the conversation. So Erica, what is there? Did you see the DIS and the EAS? You saw the DIS and the EAS either.
What's so fascinating about it is that, right, where you naturally pause gives you that hook and that hint, because if you don't know how to spell disease, now it's just dis-ease. So as long as you know.
And the thing is, notice I didn't ask you how to spell the word because the spelling was in front of you. It's really important that people understand that when I asked you and I asked the group to write it out, I'm not asking, do you know how to spell the word disease? Because I've got the writing there. I'm just having you go through the process of writing the letters out loud.
Right.
Now, and in that process, people notice something that they hadn't previously noticed. Now, the question is, if that's true, can you explain a connection between ease and disease? If it is, what's the meaning connection? What does ease have to do with disease? Does it have anything to do with it?
Right.
What do you think?
Well, I like it because it creates a story. And then again, the hook is right there because you've got dis, which means not. It's not easy. It's not.
So disease is a system is out of balance. It's not at ease. It's not in equilibrium. Right. So that's a cool idea. Right. Now, the question that I have is, what was the incredibly complex instructional strategy I used to help many already, education experts, literacy experts, for the first time consciously think of the connection between ease and disease? And all I asked you to do was name the letters as you write them.
Right.
That's all I asked you to do. Now, it's not going to work every time by any means, but if you do it in a group and in a group of people have that opportunity, you can think about it. So what I would do now is we use word sums all the time. So your pause was a hypothesis of a word sum, but we then test it with the structure and the meaning. We know there's a DIS prefix in distrust, disable, and for the sense of not. And we know there's a word ease that can be a base, like I'm at ease, I'm feeling good. Right. So we've tested the structure, but now the meaning we have to check, and we have a hypothesis of that. But the other question is, why would people not have noticed this? How could it be that expert education people haven't had this insight about this very basic word? Well, here's something. What if instead of writing out loud the word, what if the habit was to sound out as we wrote or as we read? So before I ran into understanding the structure of orthography, if I was writing the word disease on the board, because we're studying the word disease in today, I would probably go, and today we're going to look at this word disease. And if you notice where I paused there, it was after the disease. So if I have the DI and the SEASE, if I pause there, if it's disease, that to me is the only explanation as to how literate, educated people could fail to notice that structural connection, because if we think in syllables, we can hide the meaning. Because syllables, whatever they are not meaning-bearing units. They by happenstance, they might overlap with morphemes. So if I take a word like mistrust, well, in mistrust, you syllabify it with the structure, but that's just happenstance, because morphemes have nothing to do with syllables. Cats has two morphemes, but one syllable. Like there's no relationship between morphemes and syllables. And if we think in disease, that prevents us from seeing the structure. And so I would argue I use this a lot because people who have always been accurate spellers can come to a session and start to see they're getting these terms, morphology and grapheme and trigraph and all these scientific sounding terms. And that, why do I need to know all that? I'm a good speller and I didn't know all those terms. And if you're an educator, my argument is, well, good for you. You're born with a brain that meant spelling was easy for you, but you might have some kids who didn't get born with your brain. And our job is to help everybody, So my point being, if the instruction that you yourself received as a kid since kindergarten, and then all the training you had ever since, results in you not living in a world where you instantly catch the link between ease and disease, I'm claiming that misinstruction actually harmed even the successful readers and writers, because you haven't lived a life where you're constantly noticing fascinating connections between words. Now, disease is actually pretty easy. There's no pronunciation change. There's no suffixing change. It's all sitting right there. It's just that the lens through which we have been trained to look at words actually hides that connection. And the reason is this, or a central reason is this, is that in English, we have what's called a morphophonemic language. And by that, I mean that the pronunciations of the meaning elements are called morphemes. You kind of every word you have is a base, or a base with something fixed to it. But the pronunciation of those morphemes can shift all over the place. But the spelling has evolved to favor consistent spelling of those meaning elements, morphemes, over consistent spelling of the phonemes, the pronunciation units. And that means that we have a system that needs many ways to spell the sounds. And I'll show you some illustrations of that. But if you just start with the pronunciation and the syllables and the stuff, you hide that connection. So for another example, do me a favor, and I encourage everybody at home, and I'll ask you to do it, Erica, just for fun. This time I'll let you. I won't put the text in front of you and assume you can spell it, but have a go spell out. And if you can write out loud, well, actually write it out silently and then out loud for us. But the word question, if I have a question for you, how would you spell that?
How would I spell the word question?
Yeah. Just write it on a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. But and at this point, people at home have had a chance. Could you spell it out loud for us right now? I should say write it out loud, which means when I say write it out loud, you have a pen in your hand and you're naming letters as you write them. If I say spell it out loud, you're not necessarily with a pen. So you're going to write the Q as you say Q. Go ahead.
Question.
Now, you've named the letters perfectly, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm going to spell it differently than you. Now, that's exactly what I would often say in a classroom. So let me get over here. So let's take that word that you just had. You went Questio. Let me do that again. So you went one letter at a time, Question. And if I was doing this in a classroom, I would say, awesome. You named the letters perfectly, but I spell it differently. Now, as soon as you say I spell it differently, you have the kids' attention because they're saying, what do you mean you spell it differently? That's how you spell the word, right? Especially if the word is sitting up there. So watch how I spell it this time. I'll write it out loud. So those just listening will hear, but if you're seeing, you'll see that the connection with the writing. I would go Quest, Iowa. Now I can ask you, Erica, could you spell it out the same way that I spell it?
Question.
Now, what did you do differently? What did you notice that I did?
You were breaking up the word.
Where?
Pausing right after the T, right, so that I could see the word quest.
That's right. Now, I would ask you and everyone listening, have you ever consciously taught a kid that when you ask a question, you're literally going on a quest for knowledge?
That's lovely. That makes it a lot more fun. Instead of just this kind of word, this whole word that has no story, that you're just memorizing as a whole word. It reminds me of multiplication, you're just memorizing your multiplication facts, but you're not understanding anything about what multiplication means. That this enables you to see within the word something really beautiful about it, and a story. It creates a story.
And the thing that's key is if the teacher knows the structure, we can find ways to be explicit about the structure that helps the kids have that realization, right? So if we spell the word question, Question, we're actually misteaching the word question.
Well, and the other thing that's really interesting about it is that when I was looking at it, having a lot of training in Orton Gillingham, you kind of train the kids to see the TION.
Right.
And TION says shun.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's question. But what that does is it takes the beautiful story out of it. So maybe they'll get the TION, but they lose the story of the quest.
And now, and that's the other thing that many people the first time might not have spelled it one letter at a time. Some might have reflected what has been planted in their brain without thinking about it, just like you did with people do with disease. If they went QUEST. Sorry, I can't even do it. QUESTION, because they've had a TION planted in their head.
Right.
And so then I would have put the space there.
Yeah, and that ruins it. It takes all the fun out of it.
But I have to show the learner why this doesn't work.
That's right.
What are you adding TION to? Well, I don't know what a quest is, right? So the point that I'm trying to get at here is that you can make a mistake as long as I can say, oh, wait a second, I don't know what that is. But now this is the thing about falsification. When you realize that doesn't make sense, you have a reason to look for something else. And now you might notice that T and be able to see that. But there's another question to keep in mind. So I spell it QUESTION, and we can look for proof of ION in other words. But the other thing is, why don't we spell it question? And actually, I think most people, not necessarily all, would pronounce that word with a ch, not a sh. Question. And so why wouldn't a kid spell it like this?
Yeah.
Right. So because it's got the quote unquote CH sound.
And just so everybody that's listening, he spelled it QUESCHUN, which makes a lot of phonemics sense.
If we teach grapheme phoneme correspondences without reference to morphology, this is a successful application of that instruction.
Right. And a spell check may get it, but a teacher may not like it. You don't always have spell check.
But we have to think about what is the effect of the instruction, the CH sound. There is no CH in question, and yet we have the sound that we call the CH sound. So what's writing the ch? So now we have another investigation that we're going to be able to do because we have the word sum, because we'll come back to that. So the thing you notice with disease, there was no pronunciation shift in the base or the prefix that was confusing. Ease is pronounced the same as in disease, right? But in question, if I say I have a request for you, or I say I'm going on a quest, or inquest, I pronounce that T grapheme as a T. But when I add the ION, I pronounce it as a ch. And so I can understand why I can't spell question with a CH, because the CH can't represent the pronunciation T. I need the grapheme, the spelling of the base, QUEST. It needs to not only represent, I don't just need the grapheme phoneme correspondences of the word quest. I need the grapheme phoneme correspondences that can represent all of the pronunciations of that base. Everybody at home, I recommend if you do this, you just write the word jumped, as in I jumped over the fence. Just write it on a piece of paper. Now, what suffix did you use in the word jumped?
And a suffix comes at the end of a word.
Yeah.
So that would be ED.
Okay. Now I'm going to write another word. So here is the word assign, ASSIGN, right? So I'm going to assign you work. What's the suffix what suffix do I add if I make the word assignment?
MENT.
Okay. Now, I bet you anything that the many, many people at home didn't say MENT, but said meant.
Oh.
But, we have a group of one here, but in a normal group, people will pronounce that suffix meant.
Meant.
But no native English speaker says, I have an assignment to do. We say, I have an assignment to do. You say meant.
Right.
So if we get the kids to write down what they hear, MIN would be a very logical way to spell that part of the word. Because I have an assignment. It's due next week. I didn't say I have an assignment. Nobody says that.
Right.
But when I ask about the suffix in jumped, I have yet to ever meet any teacher who called it the t suffix. When you say jumped, you add the ed suffix in writing, but you add the t phoneme in speech.
Right.
Right. So why does every teacher name the ed suffix by its spelling, not its pronunciation? Every teacher. I've never heard anybody call it the t suffix. Because in played, it's pronounced d, and in painted, it's pronounced it.
I guess because the sound and the letters don't match up.
Right.
So my dyslexic self would spell jumped JUMPT.
Which would be an accurate application of the phoneme grapheme correspondences you're taught.
Right.
Because it's the T sound.
Right.
But we should never call a phoneme by a letter name. Right? It's not, phoneme isn't a letter. And if we map the t phoneme to the T grapheme, yes, that's a common way of using take and tell and bat and a bunch of words, but it doesn't give us any flexibility to use something else because we've told them there's only one way to do it. Right? It's called the T. We've mapped a too narrow connection. It's true, it works for some, but notice everybody has figured something out really important. They never refer to the ed suffix by a pronunciation because they recognize it doesn't have one pronunciation. Jumped, played, painted. I don't call it the t suffix in jumped and the d suffix in played. We just call it the ed suffix because that is what its identity is that's consistent. But and lots of people teach this. People in working within very strict phonics kind of situations, they also tell me that, oh, I teach that about the ed suffix. Absolutely. I know OG does. Absolutely. But then what I would argue is I'm delighted that you do that. But there's two things. When you do that, you are literally definitionally not teaching phonics, because I've yet to find a single definition of phonics which says anything about the role of morphology or etymology on grapheme choice. Right? So that definition of phonics is an educational term, not a linguistic term. Right. And we can look at a definition of it later, but the point is, good on you if you're doing that. But here's the thing. We teach that with the ed suffix and often with the s suffix, that it can write s or z. Right. But why would we think it's important to teach it about those two suffixes when it's actually a principle of our entire system? Right. Carol Chomsky told us in 1970, kids could be productively introduced to the fact that a morpheme doesn't have a pronunciation until it's in a word. So we're right to call it the ed suffix, because if I asked you, how do you pronounce the ed suffix? You should say, in what word? Because ed suffix doesn't have a pronunciation until it's in a word, right? And how do you pronounce the base? What is the base in question? In the word question, what's the base? Quest. You can't say that because you don't say quest in question, you say quest. The pronunciation of the base is not question, it's question. Right? So what we're going to do, a basic practice in structured word inquiry that is designed to reflect what Carol Chomsky talked about in 1970, and the understanding of the writing system, that English spelling has evolved to favor consistent spelling of the meaning units, morphemes, over consistent spelling of phonemes, the pronunciation units. So that's what happens. So the reason we need the T in quest is the CH won't work for question, but the T works for quest and question. And we'll look at that again. But so this habit, and you were talking about the memory business. So look what happens when we write out loud these word sums. So first I have Question, and I'm not sure of the structure. But then I see that, wait a second, I think there's an ION suffix. So the base looks like it's QUEST, and then I add an ION, and now I can rewrite that, and now I'm writing out loud QUEST, ION. And what I do is I pause at the plus sign, because that pause becomes a marker for the morphological boundary. And I remember doing a workshop at a school one time, and a kid said, when we do the pause, she said, it's like it puts the plus sign in my head. So now there's another piece of this that we haven't noticed. So we've got our disease. Let's go back to disease. We can actually test this. We have a hypothesis that the word ease is the base of disease, and that it would make sense that a disease is a system that's out of balance. And now we expand it beyond just someone has a sickness. You can have our environment is diseased. It's totally out of whack. There's the famous statement in the American politics, there's a cancer on the presidency. We talk about we can have a diseased economic system. It's because it has the metaphorical sense of out of balance. Well, that's a hypothesis, so we can test it by looking at the history. And if we look at Etym Online and we look at the entry for it, we'll see that it goes back to an old French root. I don't know how you pronounce it, but it's spelled AISE, that was for ease. So for this to be the present day English base, the word ease and the word disease have to share a common root. And that's from where it gets that common meaning. Right. But there's something else that we haven't addressed yet, Erica. Can you just spell out that base of disease?
EASE.
Now I'm going to spell it differently. I spell it EASE. And I also do a tapping thing that I don't know if people can see, but I'll try to do it loud enough that people can hear, where I would go EASE. Can you tap it like me?
Sure. EASE.
Now, I did it that way. You did EASE. What's the difference?
I'm not sure.
Well, what did I put? I put
you said EA.
Why do you think I did that?
Because it makes one sound.
Okay, say ease.
Oh, ease.
What do you feel at the beginning?
E.
How do you write the E pronunciation, the E phoneme in ease?
EA.
With EA. So you see what I do? I make you announce the graphemic structure even before we look at the phoneme. But if I've made you go EA, and we see the difference between EASE and EASE, and then I go EASE with the tapping, then I'm making your attention be at the thing I want you to attend to, which is, wait a second, why did he put the EA together? And then we say the word, you say ease. What do you feel at the beginning? E, how do you write the E in ease? And because I've just made you say EA, you say EA. But if I spell it EASE, I'm not signaling the grapheme phoneme correspondences.
Right.
How do you spell the?
THE.
One more time.
Okay. If I do it the way you taught me, it'd be THE.
Like that. And you did it the first time. It just wasn't so clear because we do it without knowing that we do it. THE. Right. If I spell it THE, I don't need it the time. If I spell it one letter at a time, I'm not spelling out the orthography. I'm spelling out the letters.
That's really interesting. Spelling the orthography instead of the letters.
Because letters, what's the letter sound correspondence in the? It's not, the T isn't writing anything. It's part of the TH. So if I don't signal that TH is a thing, then you get kids saying "ta" when they read. And it's not because they did something wrong. It's because they followed what we taught them. So what I work with is I want to have the teachers I work with, I want them to understand the grapheme phonic correspondences, how morphemes work, how etymology plays. And then this is this idea of using explicit instruction to facilitate rich inquiry. I have to give you the pieces. It's like if I give you a puzzle, but a bunch of the pieces are missing or from another puzzle piece, or they're bent or their stuff, there's no fun playing with puzzles. You have to give you the real pieces so that you can put them together. If every time, I don't have to stop and talk about the grapheme phonic correspondences of the TH every time I spell it, but I can, reading a book with a kid who's just learning, I can go, oh, that's the word there, that's THE. And oh, here's the word teacher, TEACHER. And the kid is living in a world of EAs and CHs, and then they can ask, or I can choose to say, why do you think I'm putting those together? And then we attach the very abstract phoneme to the also abstract grapheme, but now the grapheme is concretely on the page, and we can talk about the phoneme that links to it, but I've already given them the mental representation of the written thing, the TH or the EA or the whatever it is. So I go back and forth between grapheme phonemes all the time, but my recommendation when people learn how to do this is that if I'm spelling a word for a kid, I spell out its orthography so that I'm making explicit what is implicit.
That's the magic. You just hit on the magic. So that's the core of your approach. Mm-hmm. Now, you had said that this is a wonderful way to teach spelling, but it seems to me that it's going to work incredibly well for reading as well.
Well, I mean, yes. And so, to get into, I want to be clear when I'm making claims about research. There's very little experimental research on structured word inquiry. There's a few studies, and the ones we have are nice and are quite positive. But within one of the central aspects of structured word inquiry is understanding morphology. And there's a lot of research now, there wasn't, but there is now, on the role of morphological instruction. And what we know about morphological instruction is that with all the meta-analyses we have, if you include morphology instruction in literacy, contrary to what decades of people have suggested, hypothesized, the original hypothesis that was just kind of standard and still is around is that morphology. So, what's her name? Marilyn Adams had a book in 1990 that was hugely influential, beginning to read, and in it she made the morphology was not the main part of her book. She was talking about other stuff, but as an aside, she said, if you want to teach about morphology, it might be useful for the older kids, but it may be a problem for the younger and less able. And the argument was that, they need the phonology so much that morphology, it might just complicate matters and not ready for it. But she did not claim that she had evidence for this. She just said, this is my hypothesis. The problem is we treated it as if it was an empirical finding, because a decade later, that Adams' book was 1990, and I'm not saying she's the first person to say this, it's just that she made this statement in this hugely influential book in 1990. And then in 2020, we have the National Reading Panel, a decade later, and they don't once make a single comment about testing that hypothesis. Maybe teaching morphology might be helpful. No, they didn't talk about it. So we have this hypothesis now, it's a 10-year-old hypothesis that's being treated as though it's an empirical finding, as if we don't even have to ask about it. And now later, and we'll talk more about this next time, but we do have a bunch of meta-analyses, and it turns out the finding is, in all of the meta-analyses that looked at the effect of teaching, including morphology in instruction, that the less able and the younger gained the most. So it's the opposite.
What's the takeaway there?
The takeaway is, if we just follow the instruction, we have evidence that tells us we should be including morphology in the instruction of the younger and the less able. But what we do not have research evidence on yet is how best to teach morphology, because you would need research that compared teaching morphology this way to teaching it that way. And that's something that we basically, as far as I know, have nothing. We have no research on that. But what structured word inquiry is saying, hey, we already know we should be including morphology in instruction. So here's a hypothesis that I put out there for people to test. And the hypothesis is not only should we teach about morphology, we should be using it to teach the interrelationship with phonology and morphology. And my argument is anybody who is rightly concerned, like I am, that we need to be giving kids, all kids, especially dyslexic kids, the best possible grapheme phoneme correspondence instruction, why would we not avail ourselves to the fact that morphology makes sense of grapheme choices that cannot be made sense of otherwise? We can give more understanding. We just talked about question. How do you know how could you possibly know that you don't spell with a CH in question? Well, you'd have to you can't know unless you say, question has the base quest, which has the t pronunciation, but that t changes to a ch in question. And so we need the T that can do both of those things. The CH can't write t. Now, that's a terrible thing, again, to do without looking at text. But maybe next time, I will show you research from the morphology research that showed that the biggest effect of the morphologic, when you look at the literacy outcomes of, there was 2 meta-analyses by Goodwin and Ann, 2010, 2013, and they showed that in their 2 morphological meta-analyses, the greatest effect of including morphological instruction was for phonological outcomes, even greater than the morphological outcomes. And so what I'm saying is, teaching, because we have a morphophonemic system, even if our only motivation is to teach grapheme phoneme correspondence is better, we should be looking at structured word inquiry, because it offers a whole domain that is not applied in phonics. And this is different than saying, I teach phonics over here and I teach morphology over here. Good if you're adding the morphology and it benefits, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the interrelationship of morphology and phonology. And that we have very, very little, we don't have any, experimental evidence testing those things. And all I'm trying to do is say, let's start doing that.
That's right. And you have a lot of qualitative evidence from your work that it's been very successful. Now, for the layperson, describe this in layman's terms, because using words like phonemic, morphology, grapheme, I'm sure a lot of people are getting a little lost.
Yeah. So let me give you a brief attempt, and then I'll go back and give you my kind of origin story that is a way of highlighting what we're talking about. But so the point is, as a layman thing, we went through the ed suffix. We could see that the ed suffix has more than one pronunciation, and that we've always called it the ed suffix because we can't bring ourselves to call it the ed suffix. Like, what are we going to call it if we pronounce it? So we already sussed that out. We just didn't know that it was a principle of the whole system. And so what we need to do is say, it turns out that when we are trying to understand the grapheme phoneme correspondence, we're trying to understand the associations between the letters on the page and how we pronounce them. It's helpful if we don't spell the THE, because the T isn't writing anything. It's part of a TH. So if I go THE, well, now I can have a name for that TH that makes it different than the E. Now, right? So then I can say, if I call it TH, what do you call that? Well, lots of schools use the phrase letter teams. Well, there's a problem with letter teams, and it's out of this effort to be less, easier on kids, but actually it makes it harder, because how many letters are in a team? It doesn't tell you. So let me look at a brief word here, KNIGHT. Can you spell that for me?
KNIGHT. Did you put a pause? Did you do a pause between the IGH and the T?
No pauses, and that's a key thing you notice. And this is how we do it. This is by this conversation. You just asked a key question that's going to help your whole audience. And that is, I'm now going to do the tapping, but this I'm going to tell you is a base. There's nothing here you can remove, is there? This is the word. I'm sorry, I didn't say the word for your audience. It's the word knight, as in knight in shining armor, right? And so, which of course is not the same as the spelling of the word N-I-G-H-T for night, for nighttime. Now, this is actually another profoundly important understanding. This word, both of these words might be thought of as irregular, especially this one, right? And people struggled with this. But I spelled this one first, and I'm going to tap it now. K-N-I-G-H-T. When you announced that, I heard an I-G-H-T, but there's no I-G-H-T. How do I know there's no I-G-H-T? Say night.
Night.
What do you feel at the end?
I feel the T.
You don't feel the T because you didn't say nighty. You said night. You feel the T.
T.
Now, excellent. How do you write the T in this word night?
T.
With the T, and I'm going to use the word grapheme now. Because it's not the letter T, it's the grapheme T. This is how I get you used to the word grapheme just by using it.
Right.
And I know that this stuff always goes on so long, but let's take this is how I will get people used to, including young kids. I just use the word grapheme. Do you recognize something in the word grapheme that's familiar to you?
Graph.
There's the G-R-A-P-H, right?
Yeah, E-M-E. Got it.
G-R-A-P-H. And if you have a dictionary and you look up the word graph and you go down to the interesting bit at the bottom and you get we'll see that we get, we'll go back to graphics, sorry. We get to writing, to write, from this grapheme to write. And if we keep going, if you have time, you keep going, you'll get to graphos for writing or mark, right? So when we're talking about a grapheme, it's the part that's written, and we're looking at computer graphics, marks with light. And you can talk about photography, marks with light, actually. And if you talk about a biography, it's writing about life. Autobiography is writing about my own life. And what's the stuff in the pen that you write with? It's graphite. It's got the mineral that has the characters. It leaves a mark when you write it. So when I talk, if I take a little tangent like that, I can say, so grapheme is the written part. The spoken parts are phonemes. Well, if you look at phoneme, it actually is like this. And what do you think when you see the P-H-O-N-E? What does that make you think of?
A telephone.
Telephone. I can talk to you on my telephone, which means I'm talking here and you can hear me way over there. If I look at it through a telescope, the tele is for away. That's why telephone works. Scope, far away, a telescope, see. Phonemes, phonics, phonology, whenever you have that P-H-O-N-E base, it's about sound. And if I can take that tiny little tangent, now we come back to our words here. And I have this word night for night in shining armor, and I have this word night for nighttime. This word is cool because it has a digraph, a trigraph, and a single letter grapheme. If I go K-N-I-G-H-T, which do you think is the trigraph?
There isn't one because you put I-G-H-T all together.
I didn't. I did K. No, I didn't. I did K-N. I-G-H-T.
Oh, I didn't hear that pause.
Yeah, I should have done it better. And that's why the tapping is good. K-N-I-G-H-T.
Got it.
Right? Because we highlighted that when you said night, you felt the T at the end, and that was written with a T, which means there is no such thing as an I-G-H-T.
Right.
Because the T is writing T. The I-G-H is writing I. You can talk about onsets and rhymes if you like, and you could talk about it as a rhyme, but this is not, there's no I-G-H-T 4-letter grapheme. But so my question is, of these three graphemes, which is the trigraph?
I-G-H.
And how do you know that?
Because it has tri, which is 3, graph, which is right.
How do you know tri is for 3? You're right.
Because
how do young kids know this?
Because you taught me like you would teach them.
And they would say, well, the guy, you know what a triangle is? What's a triangle? What's a tricycle? Young kids know what a triangle and a tricycle and all that is, right? And so then it's easier to teach young kindergartners what a trigraph is than a digraph, because they don't know DI for 2. They know tri for 3. Once I say KN IGHT, the IGH is a trigraph. The single letter grapheme's got to be the T. I guess the digraph is the KN.
Right.
Now compare that to teaching K as a silent K in night. That doesn't make any sense. There's no silent K. It's a KN. Right? Like, and if you look at a word like, let's take the word like in the, it's not a silent T and the H is writing th. It's a TH. And in back, it's not a silent C and the K is writing, it's a CK. There is no such thing as a silent K. KN just happens to be a very common, not the most common, but a common digraph for the phoneme n, happens to happen in words of Old English origin. And it turns out it's pretty cool. The word night for unite, the word night for, and the word no, KNOW, they used to be pronounced kno and knite and stuff, apparently. The pronunciation changed, but the spelling remained. Actually used to be a CN and then it became a KN, But we can have these stories attached to these things.
Yes, and that's it. The story.
Right. The story. And now the language. Now we have grapheme. We have the GRAPH is teaching you tons of vocabulary. But now we can use grapheme and phoneme all the time. So here's an example in a young class where I was at a school in Chicago doing great stuff in kindergarten, grade 1 with SWI. And I'm going to do a lesson. And I'm talking about this homophone principle that has to do with something with the fact that typically words that can be pronounced the same are spelled differently to signal the difference in meaning. And that's a good thing. And so we get to this word homophone. And I'm asking the kid, well, if hom is for same, what's the phone part for? And just like you went to telephone, that's what I was expecting the kids to go to. And so this tiny little boy raises his hand and says, phoneme? Because in that class, the kindergarten teacher from the beginning of the year who's working with structured word inquiry was using the terms phoneme and grapheme every day. So for that kid, the word homophone reminded him of the word that they use every day in kindergarten, phoneme. And he was right, because it had to do, and he could be right because he knows phoneme has something to do with sound. I talked about homophones that sounded the same. That language is not too hard for young kids. If we use it we explicitly teach what it is. We get to use word sums and stories and stuff to tell them. And then that's just the language that they grow up with. We are worried about using these big terms with young kids because we're not familiar with them ourselves.
You're right.
But the newness of a concept to us has nothing to do with the newness to the kid. We don't worry that the kid doesn't know the word responsibility. We teach them the word responsibility and relationship and these big old words because we are comfortable doing that. But
the beautiful thing is they can combine all of these little stories that you teach them, and it turns into a game, and kids love games. So basically you're turning spelling and reading into word games.
But you're right. But what I'm really doing is turning it into scientific inquiry. And I'm explicit about that with young kids because kids love being scientists too.
Yeah.
I'm explicit. We are literally doing science. We are testing hypotheses, rejecting ones that don't work. And kids, I talk about that with the young kids, and they love being scientists. And yes, it's got the game-like thing, and you can make games with it and such. But it's always driven by this idea. Well, let's be scientists about this. You know, what do you think what would be the reason that this word is spelled that way? And what we have to do is begin from the premise that there's an understanding to have. The thing that has killed everything is this accepting of exceptions. Because once you have exceptions, how can you falsify any hypothesis? If I say that the word does is irregular, then I can hold on to any hypothesis that I give about how spelling works if every time my hypothesis doesn't work, I blame the spelling system for being broken. That's not what we do in science. In science, we don't talk about exceptions. We talk about falsification. The fact that the traditional way of teaching the spellings of words calls words like does irregular when we can explain them if we understand the writing system, that means what we're doing when we accept exceptions, we're rejecting falsification, which is actually rejecting doing science.
So structured word inquiry is a much more logical and sound way of teaching kids to spell.
I mean, it's based on always seeking to have a more logical, comprehensive understanding of the writing system. And when we study a word, we're not really just studying that word. We're using that word to understand the system.
What I also love is you're teaching kids to use metacognitive skills.
Oh, yeah.
You're teaching them how to think. You're teaching them actually executive functioning skills. And we know that now that kids are most open to developing their executive functioning skills when they're quite young.
I can't I think all of that is true, but I can't overemphasize the element of practice and integrating motor movements for when we talk about cognitive load theory, the idea of how to build well integrated mental representations in our head, which is what we're trying to do if we're doing what orthographic mapping would call building sight words. You want to build lexical representations that are between the connections of pronunciation, spellings, and meanings of words that are so well bound together, this is literally their language too, that you have automated access to it. Well, I'm arguing that if we tell kids to memorize the spelling of does, that's not an effective way to do that mapping. But I could explain to your audience how does works very quickly, and then we would be announcing the orthography of that word in such a way that doesn't just build the spelling of does, it's also for the spelling of doing and redo and done and these other words that are connected in meaning, and more importantly, just the overall principle that nobody told me about until my 9th year as a classroom teacher, that English spelling makes perfect sense, is totally well organized, and its primary job is the representation of the sense and meaning of the language to those who already know and speak the language. I know that's a big mouthful, but the point being, and so perhaps I should share my kind of little origin story that helps people, because it's coming from me totally not understanding a spelling and having a matrix totally blow my mind and help me understand all this stuff. So maybe that is helpful. But so the story is that before I went to this conference, I was teaching at this school in Indonesia. It's an expat kid, so I'm teaching in English. And I'm trying to write a note in a kid's homework book. Johnny had a really good day. He's on a contract and I have to sign his notebook. But I go to write the word really, and I have to stop at the first L because I don't know if really has one or two L's. So pause and think about how many times my mind has encountered the word really in print by the 9th year of being a classroom teacher. My orthographic brain isn't very good because as soon as I get that, I can't remember how many L's are in really. Most people don't have this problem. So I have to look up in a dictionary. I see that it's got 2 L's. I finish writing really and hope the kid doesn't miss the bus because I couldn't spell really. But I also have the experience that your kids have when you're forced to look in a dictionary to get a spelling. When I close the dictionary, the thought in my head, if I have to write really tomorrow, I'll have the same question.
Right.
Because I've demonstrated, I've probably seen that word hundreds of thousands and thousands of times. It wasn't going to be this event that was the one that finally stuck. I'm not good at orthographically mapping a sight word really in my head, no matter how many times I've read it and seen it. I could read it, no problem, but I couldn't spell it. And then I go and I talk to, a week later, I talked to a friend who's a librarian, And I'm making fun of myself. And I say, you'll never believe it. I didn't know if really had one or two L's the other day. And she rolls her eyes at me. Come on, Pete. Of course it's two L's. It's really. To which I say, well, how do I know it's really? How come it's not real E? Now she shoves that under the rug because she doesn't have an answer for it. She doesn't even notice the contradiction. But it helps me not at all. But she's rolling her eyes at me because what she's thinking is, oh my God, what has the world come to when grade 4 teachers don't know how to spell really? What are they teaching them in teachers college? If Pete just pulled his sleeves up and got to work, he could be a better speller. I'm afraid not. Have you met any bad spellers who just did what they did and got better? Well, with structured word inquiry we do, but what she was doing though is she is making a error between causation and correlation. She's thinking, I'm an accurate speller. I was taught to syllabify. I was taught to do all these things, and I'm a good speller. I must be a good speller because of how I was taught. So I'm going to tell Pete to teach how I was taught, and then he'll be a better teacher. But what she's not recognizing is she's not a good speller because of how she was taught. She's a good speller because she was born with a good orthographic memory, and nobody's going to teach me to have her orthographic memory. Right? And so she doesn't notice this problem. How did she know to syllabify between the L's? How did she know to go really? And I didn't know. Because she has the spelling really in her head. So she syllabifies between the two L's, which is exactly what I lack. So she's giving me a strategy to remember.
It's frustrating because you don't say really. You say really.
You say really.
Really.
You say really.
So that would only have one L. So I get it.
But see, the thing is, she's being honest. This is her experience. But she's not aware that she's thinking about the two L's and really when she syllabifies. It's automatic for her. But what she doesn't realize is that if you do, now I was making fun of myself. I'm already okay. I'm teaching. I'm happy. I managed to be a terrible speller and have a happy life. Some kids' dyslexia is traumatic in the most extreme ways I can't even get into. But so I did not have anything of that trauma. So I'm okay. I don't care if I'm a bad speller. But
you're not anymore.
But and I still make spelling mistakes, but now I'm excited because now I know how to what I should do to understand that spelling, and then I'll remember it. If I understand the spelling, I remember it. When we understand things, we don't have to memorize them. We have to memorize things that we don't understand.
Yes, I am such a proponent of that. That is so important. If I understand it, then there's no reason to memorize it.
Exactly, because it's there. Right? But non-dyslexics are able to remember spellings without understanding.
Right.
Dyslexics can't.
Just like with multiplication, they can just use rote memorization, no problem.
Right. Yeah, and I'm slow at my multiplication tables too. But anyways, so we go through that, and but you notice what she's doing. She is giving me a strategy that would only work if you could already spell. She's giving us a strategy to become a better speller that would only work for words you can already spell. But she doesn't know she's doing that. And so if you do that to a kid, that just, as you said, frustrates things more because you think, I'm doing exactly what you say, but I keep getting it wrong, but everybody next to me seems to get it. I must be stupid. So that is the background under which I go to this conference, and I see this blurb for a real spelling talk. And he says, English spelling makes perfect sense, has no exceptions, and is mainly about meaning, or something like that. And I think, yeah, right. I got to go see the snake oil salesman. And so I go to the session expecting, I was curious because it was so absurd. But I also have a history of a bad speller. So I was curious what he would say, but I honestly had no expectation that this was going to be a logical thing, because that was insane. And one of the first things he does is he puts the word real on the board. And we talk about that word real. So it's a real nice day or something like that. And then he says, well, what could we add to that word to make another word? And so he puts an ly here and a line here. And, so that's the word really. And in that instant, I knew I'd never have to look in a dictionary again for the word really.
Right, because he took the base word of real, just for the audience that's listening.
Sorry.
So you've got the base word of real, then he put a line, and then he added the ly. So now it makes sense. You have something to hold on to instead of going back to your old dysfunctional way of reading that didn't give you the spelling.
And this is with meaning.
With meaning.
Right? So I know how to spell the word real with real, and then I know that I can add an ly.
So was that just a coincidence that he actually used that word?
He just happened to pick the word that I had an issue with a week before. But I would have had issues with thousands of words, so it's not that much of a coincidence. But anyways, but the thing that was striking is that when someone tried to help me by syllabification, it made me feel angrier and had no success. But when they simply just showed me the structure, I instantly knew I understood it, so I don't have to look in a dictionary ever for this word.
Right.
And I also know that there's no convention for dropping L's. And I know the word real has an L and the suffix ly has an L. That's why there's two L's.
Right.
Okay. But then he didn't stop there. So now he now tosses out into the group, and so we get you could be a realist, right? Someone who lives in the real world, and you could be realistic. Oh, that would mean that now you have to have a line here, and then we can have a line here. So, Erica, if I have the word realistic and I have the base I can treat this as a base, real, with an ist and an ic, how many morphemes are in that word?
Morphemes meaning the breaking down of the sounds. 1, 2, 3.
Yes, but not the breaking down of the sounds. What I'm showing, and what I should be doing while I did this is what Michelle would should have been doing, is I would go he would have the real, and then he would add, as he's building the matrix, he adds the ist. Excuse me, and then I add the ic, and when I put those together, and I know that this is where the seeing is helpful. So now I'm going to write out loud. I have my real, ist, ic. So on the left side of the word sums, there's plus signs between the meaning units. On the right side, it appears like in a book, but I've announced the structure by pausing at the boundaries. Now, when you look at this word sum, and I say to you, how many morphemes are in this word? What do you think, Erica?
Yeah, so then it makes
3.
it really clear. It's very clear that it's 3. And I love how you're saying word sums. That's really cool because you're adding up the pieces.
And we have to be careful because it's not really math, because this is not an equal sign, because it's a process arrow. And we'll show you shortly that there can be suffixing changes that show that it doesn't add up. It's a process. But word sums is the kind of conversational term for this. The linguistic term is a linguistic algorithm. But the point is, what I was also doing there, Erica, was introducing how I introduce the word morpheme to young kids. Because if I have these 3 chunks and I call them blaps or I call them morphemes, the kids figure out when he said morpheme, he must mean that has 3. If they say 2 because they thought that one must be these, oh, no, that one has 3. Really, how many morphemes? 2. So I use the word morpheme in a context that makes sense, and then morpheme just becomes normal.
Got it.
Right? Now, but I haven't even hit the coolest one, because we can also add some prefixes, because I could say something was unreal. Like, that was amazing. That goal was unreal. I couldn't even believe it. Right?
So between each of these morphemes, you're adding lines.
Right. Exactly.
And that gives them that visual as well.
And in the word sum, the plus sign has to correlate to the vertical lines. That's a necessary relationship. And so now I can put an SUR there. We could talk about a surreal art or surrealistic art, right? So as we build the morphemes in this family of an orthographic morphological family, the words that share the same base, but they have a connection and meaning as well. So that's cool. And now we can see why surreal has 2 R's, because there's an R in the prefix and an R in the base. But you can't tell from surreal how many R's there are from the pronunciation.
And that is so much fun. You're making puzzles.
Exactly.
You're making visual puzzles. And then, and I love to help kids learn how to visualize, because so many of them can't because they don't have the cognitive space to do it. This actually can get them to visualize because they're focusing less on phonics.
And
which doesn't work for spelling a lot of the time.
What I'm doing is I'm teaching the grapheme phoning correspondences that phonics wants to teach and I want to teach in the context of the orthography system.
Yes, that's it.
So the danger is that when people hear that I can't use the word phonics to describe what we do in structured word inquiry, they think that means you're crazy. You don't even teach grapheme phonic correspondences. In fact, it's been even stated in a peer-reviewed journal, and it's just ridiculous. Every time we spell, we're announcing the graphemes in the base, right? But anyways, the point being, the culture of education, the only word we have associated with teaching grapheme phonic correspondence is phonics. But what I'm saying is that is a false limitation. That's not the only way you teach grapheme phonic correspondence. And what we're suggesting is we should teach, not only should we teach what are the available grapheme phonic correspondences, we should teach how they operate in the orthography system, which means they're constrained by morphology and etymology in ways that are understandable, that can make sense of grapheme phonic correspondences that others didn't get. So the final one here that is it's not gonna be final, but the thing that really blew my, like, I'm already had this experience with really, but that wasn't even the big one. The big one was when he put the ITY there. So this is a matrix. When I put that box around it, we have all those lines. But what word, can you read for us the word when you take the RE? Let me do the word sum too. So I'm taking the REAL, and I'm now adding the ITY. Notice I say ITY quickly. A suffix is I write quickly because ITY, IST, URE, and the SUR and the UN, we announce quickly as a group to build that orthographic representation.
I'd never looked at that word that way.
Well, exactly. And so I've got
my God. And I had trouble reading it because I don't look at it that way. I was like, reality?
Yeah.
Reality? No, but it's reality.
And why is this the one that is mind-bending? What is so exciting about this?
I see the word real and reality.
Exactly.
I live in the real world. Never seen that because of the way I said it was hit the real word.
Exactly. And here is the absolutely, there's lots of people who, SWI has some controversy. People aren't always happy with it, but it's all it is teaching how the writing system works. I mean, so it's a weird thing to have a problem with. But
it's reasoning. If you had a hard time with language reasoning, then that may not be the best approach for you. But most dyslexic individuals, for example, are very good at reasoning.
Well,
but they're not so good at the phonics. So that makes sense.
Well, so now I want to come back to what's key about reality, but the spelling of reality. Is that the people we identify as dyslexic very commonly caught by not only when phonemic awareness deficit is so associated with that. Well, the point I would say is, yes, that certainly if someone has a phonemic awareness deficit, if that's not something they're good at identifying, manipulating phonemes, it is, they definitely require the best possible grapheme phoneme instruction because that's a weakness of them. But why would we put all of the leverage for their learning on the one thing we've identified as their weakness? And we do not have a deficit. Dyslexics are not known for a deficit in critical thinking or reasoning or lateral thinking. In fact, these are thought to be things that they're particularly good at. But the matrix and the word sum helps us understand in a way that we were not able to understand before. I would argue it helps non-dyslexics too. But the thing about reality, the spelling of reality, is that this was the moment I realized a foundational thing that linguists had long understood, that nobody had ever mentioned to me in my 9 years of the classroom teacher, and most teachers don't know, that in English, the spellings of words favors consistent spelling of the meaning units over consistent spelling of the pronunciation units.
Yes.
And so reality is, now look what this does for us, Erica, is not only that, we have the homophone R-double-E-L. So how am I supposed to remember which real is which? And notice I spelled this R-double-E-L. So this is like for a movie reel or a fishing reel, right? This is for something that turns. Even the word reel, like a musical reel, is like the idea is that it turns over and over. How can I remember that the reel for a real nice day has the E and the A, but this reel has the double E? Well, because what we talked about earlier, this wouldn't work, because that can't represent the pronunciation reality, because the double E digraph is very boring. That would have to be reality, right? So what we find is that now when we look at words in contrast to each other and with each other, with meaning, with this, you would never forget, because you need the spelling that can represent the pronunciation reality and the pronunciation real. Right. And notice,
that's really cool. It's really cool. It's really mapping out language in a completely different way that's more foolproof.
Well, and it's science. So you can make mistakes, and I won't go into it, but there's something more we need to learn about this thing. We can treat it like a base, but there's something else going on there, but that's okay. We can, this matrix is the thing that started me on. This is 2001. This is how it started for me. And I had the benefit that by chance he picked a word that I had recently had this thing with. But that's the other part about structured word inquiry. When the teacher understands the basics of the system, we don't need we don't have a program where you teach these graphemes and then these morphemes and then these words and then that everybody follows, which doesn't meet the interest of the class. You can give me any word in your class that you're studying. If I know how to analyze that word, I can target the kid's his own or her interest. This word, this word bugs you. Let's see if we can understand that one. Or we're studying this word. Let's try that. And so as long as the teacher has understanding, we can target the instruction directly at the kid's interests and weaknesses and strengths. And the other thing that is crucial is that, let's say you have kids that are older and really struggling, right? So I didn't think of that. So I'm going to pull up something as I'm talking.
And then after that, I would like to pull you back, and because we have to wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about how people can learn this approach. Do you have do you have workbooks? Do you have courses? Tell me a little bit about that when you're done with that.
Absolutely. So now you think about kids who are in grade 7, grade 8, reading at a grade 4 level or something like that. And just imagine the, emotional personal experience of being faced with getting remedial training with grade 4 kind of language. And you're practicing this thing that has already failed you. The motivation is so weak, and it's just a frustration, right? But if I'm going to work with a kid in that situation, I often like to very soon look at something like this, that we can, it's called a word net this one is from Real Spelling, but we have this SCI.
So you're showing me this big kind of, almost like a word map.
It's called the word net, but instead of the boxes, it's got arrows pointing to the other morphemes. And in the middle is this SCI. And one thing you can go from the SCI to is an ENCE suffix, and that builds science, right? So SCI plus ENCE is science, but a scientist does, we know that there's science and scientist, but how are they related? Because you can't add ENT to ENCE, but it's because the base wasn't science. It's not that we added something to science, it's that we added ENT to SCI to get scientist. We had the IST.
Oh, this is really fun. This is more game oriented again. Yeah. I mean, you can have kids have so much fun with this.
Absolutely. And what words can we get? And now we know that the SCI is for knowing. So if you do science, you know a lot. If you're a scientist, you know a lot of stuff. But what if you are UNCONSCIOUS? Now you're unconscious.
Oh, you don't know anything. It works.
Yeah, and the funny thing is the kids know unconscious before they know conscious, because they know it means to be knocked out. But if you're conscious, you know about things, right? And if you have a conscience, you know the difference between right and wrong. So the vocabulary is enormous. But then you can say to a kid, and I'm doing this, I should be doing with word sums, but just for time, I'm not, that now I can say to a kid, well, what would happen if, I just have to do this. So now we're looking here and I go, well, we have SCI plus ENCE. Notice I say ENCE as a group because I want that ENCE just to become automated. And then we have SCI, ENCE, so that's science. But what if I tell the kid, well, what if we put this PRE in front? So I have a PRE plus SCI plus ENCE. That would give me PRE, SCI, ENCE. All right. Now I could ask a kid, do you recognize that word? Which I do not expect that they would. But now, because we've read all these words, that grade 8 struggling kid might say pre-science. And I say, okay, so what might that word mean? And because he knows that science is about knowing, and that pre-RE, prefix, preview, whatever, it's for before. And they usually say, well, to know before, which is exactly what prescience means. So I just say, well, it turns out we don't typically pronounce it pre-science. It's either prescience or prescience. And you've just read it perfectly because it means to know before.
You're developing vocabulary. They're going to do so much better on the SATs. I mean,
oh my God. Yeah. But it is not just this family that's doing that. And I will talk a little bit about the research, because what we showed in the study that I did, that is the sort in my book, and that is that when we taught this way to grade 4 and 5 kids, and we compared it to grade 4 and 5 kids with typical instruction, that not only did kids get better at defining words that they were exposed to, and they were exposed to 420 words in 20 days. We didn't explicitly teach them all. That not only were they better at defining words that they were exposed to, they were better. So this SIGN matrix was the first lesson in that intervention and in my book. So not only were they better at defining words like assignment and design and designate and all that, but they were better at defining words that weren't on the matrix but had the base. So I had to be careful not to use the word significant, because that was a test at the end of the study where we were trying to find out, could kids define a word they weren't exposed to but shared the base, and they were. So I didn't have to teach them significant for them to get better at defining a word like that was just related to what they're taught.
So not only does this help with spelling, it helps with meaning.
Well, and reading and vocabulary and scientific
and everything
thinking,
and writing and yes.
Right. But and in fact, I will argue, while I would argue improving spelling accuracy is super valuable, it is by far the least exciting. It's the goal I have, my least high goal. Reading, vocabulary, understanding the world are the far richer benefits of this work, but spelling accuracy is great too. And we also got effects on that. But so the point is, now you talk to that grade 8 kid, now I'm not giving them baby words. I'm dealing with word, and then with that prescience thing, I get to tell a kid who's usually dealing with baby words, by the way, that word prescience that you just figured out, most university kids probably don't know what that word means. So the motivation for those kids is entirely different. because all of a sudden their intellect is being respected, which deserves respect. Their reading ability it has defined all of their experiences with their reading instruction until this moment, because their reading ability doesn't meet their intellectual ability, and so they feel like they're being treated like they're stupid. But when you start with something like that, it's a whole different ballgame. And
now they love words. Words are fun.
And they have
new words are an exploration.
Yeah.
Wow, amazing. So tell me, what do you have that can help people to learn this approach? Do you have any workbooks? Do you have courses?
Right. So what I should so the website is here, WordWorks Literacy Center. And so if you're curious about this work, the About WordWorks page is probably the best place to go. And there's a bunch of background and then these videos and interviews of ways of understanding all my published research and all that. So I recommend that place to explore. I have to update this. These are courses that I teach, but there's also all sorts of free resources and such. Every Monday at 5 p.m., I do a free SWI Digital Drop-in. There's no sign up. People can just join. And lots of stuff here. But down here, there is a link to my teacher resource book, which is the lessons that I used in my intervention study. So there's direct research evidence that teaching from those lessons, which takes the teacher through working with matrices and word sums, all a scientific approach to follow the suffixing conventions, which are totally reliable. So
it's just it teaches you how much of a lesson is this and how long is it?
So, for example, there it is. Okay.
So is it kind of like a workbook in a way?
It is. So this is the first lesson here, where you discover that pronunciation shift with sign and signal, and then you see signature. And in signature, we run into the fact that this E is replaced by that vowel suffix. But we don't answer the question. You now do the next lesson, and you see that happens with packages, packaging, packaged. And so you work through these things, and then we go through an investigation to find out, well, how do you know when to replace an E? So here I have a base where some of the suffixes replace the E and some don't. And so we act like scientists. What suffixes caused the change? What suffixes didn't? And the kids always work it out. Oh, the suffixes are where the vowel letter do. And then there's stuff for the teacher to read about it. And then you go on to this page where we investigate, we test the hypothesis. Does that hypothesis work that vowel suffixes replace final non-syllabic E's, single silent E's? And when you work through this, we end up confirming the hypothesis. And it also points to the Real Spelling resource, where there's all sorts of places you can expand on. And that's a link I'll make sure I get you to. But so that's the way the book goes. You have lessons that you investigate that you can just give the kids. But what I'm hoping for is that people work with it and then they take tangents that the kids like, but they have a way to go through scientifically all those suffixing conventions, but then hopefully you apply them to words that you're studying. So that is a useful book for getting people going. But on the website, I teach online courses all the time, and there's other people who do also, and my website points to all these other people doing this great work that I highly recommend as well. And the main source, anybody who's seriously curious about this stuff, the place that I would highly recommend to go is the Real Spelling Toolbox, this is the source that started me. It was this guy who I saw in 2001. And this is like a comprehensive description of the writing system. There's this free theme here. I don't make any money from Real Spelling, but it's his work that has allowed all of the people doing this work to really grow. And you can see what kind of topics are in there. It's all over the place. Amazing, but it's linguistically accurate information.
Can you give me a list of all of these links?
Yeah, I'll email you a set of links that are useful. And I can send a few recommended things that people who see this might want to do next.
That'd be great, because what I can do is I can put that down in the show notes, and I think
exactly
that's really helpful for everyone.
That'd be much easier. Yeah.
Fantastic. Wow, we went a really long time, but it's really, really important. And I see you can't. It's a difficult thing to break down into a simple.
Well, that point, this is a key point, and it's true about many things. But if you are trying to help somebody understand something that is quite different than the way they've looked at the world, you can't do it quickly. If you are just repeating what you've always heard with small variations, you can talk about things quick. So that's one of the things that's super problematic, is that you have to engage with words to understand what I'm talking about. So you have to be willing to do that. And that takes time, but there's no hurry. There's all this stuff to do. And so I can tell you my one of my little parables.
Okay.
that you might be able to, you can, or you don't need to, but you might be able to sneak into this thing. But, I would argue that even from what we've just talked about in this short amount of time, long session, but short in general, I think it's clear that there are things about the writing system that our previous instruction hasn't taught us, right? So please don't think that if you watch this video, you should drop anything you're currently doing. That's not what I'm recommending. What I'm recommending is that if I can explain a word to you in such a way that you understand it, we kept talking about does that I didn't show you, but I'll send you a link to a video on that. Okay, start trying some of the new things that gave you a new understanding and see where that takes you. But don't worry about dropping other things, because you shouldn't drop things until you know what you're replacing them with. So I want to take away this idea that I'm telling people, stop teaching phonics, stop teaching what you're doing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, if I just gave you an experience that helped you understand a spelling that you previously didn't understand, or a connection between words that you didn't previously understand, that's enough evidence that you should offer that understanding to your kid. And over time, you can see what you want to drop. And so the parable that I get a kick out of is that, at the end of a session like this, imagine this story. Imagine you've gone camping and you're going and you're going to go for a hike, and you go before lunch. And so you're going for your hike. It's lovely. And suddenly you realize you're getting hungry and you start to head back. But then suddenly you realize things don't look very familiar. And you're wondering, wait a second. You feel like a little bit lost, and then you notice that the cliff is on the left side of the road of the river. But you know that if you were on your left side, you know that if you were going the right way, the cliff had to be on the right side. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that you saw the cliff? It's a good thing. It's a drag that the reality of the situation is you're going the wrong way. But if you hadn't noticed the cliff, you could have gone further in the wrong direction. So recognizing your mistake, that's called falsification. That's why science works. So thank gosh you saw the cliff indicating you're going the wrong way. So you turn around and you start going the other way. Now, keep the cliff on the other side of you. And then at least you don't know where your camp is, but you're now heading the right direction. You don't have all the answers, but you at least are going in the right direction. My argument is that we have been studying the writing system with a false understanding that it's all about representation of sound and maybe these other little things. But what we haven't understood, that it's this interrelationship. And so you're not going to know all the answers, but at least you have like a northern star pointing you. Keep going this way and you'll make fewer mistakes. You're heading towards understanding. You're heading towards your camp. But if you don't recognize the value of falsification, the only silly thing to do in that situation would be to say, well, I've been walking 2 hours this direction now. I'm not turning around now. That would be an absurd thing to do. But the danger is, if you saw on this podcast, you are aware that there are flaws in your current understanding. The question is, what are you going to do about it?
Beautiful. Well, I think that's a wonderful way for us to wrap up this amazing podcast. And
I think, and I would love to have another one. I'd really like to talk about the research side more, and especially associated with orthographic mapping and stuff like that. But that we can work that out later.
We will. We're definitely going to do that another time. I'll get through this one and post it, and then we'll meet again for another one. But this has been really fun.
I apologize for breaking your podcast length record.
No, actually, that's good. I think there are a lot of people that enjoy long podcasts. I just want to make sure that they make it to the end, because there's so much sweet stuff at the end of this podcast. So,
all right.
Anyway, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you for listening to our discussion at the Go Dyslexia podcast. This episode was brought to you by Good Sensory Learning, an educational product-based website that brings delight to learning. I hope you will join us again.